Greetings, Mandrake Road family. So we continue our series on the Sabbath. We have 2 more weeks, and this week we are looking at a text that maybe quite a few people know. Hebrews is one that is talked about quite a bit, but it's not explored deeply in our faith tradition. But today we're going to look at Hebrews 4, 1 through 11, and talk a little bit about Sabbath as an integral part of creation, not just, not just, as we've been talking about, not just this thing that the Israelites did or that God required by law, but why we're talking about Hebrews now is to prepare us for actually talking about Genesis 2, and we see this idea in Hebrews 4. We're going to see this kind of pointing back to Genesis 2. So I'm going to go ahead and read our text for today. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest is still open, let us take care that none of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For indeed, the good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, "As in my anger I swore, they shall not enter my rest." Though his works were finished at the foundation of the world, for in one place it speaks about the seventh day as follows, "And God rested on the seventh day from all his works." And again, in this place it says, "They shall not enter my rest." Since therefore it remains open for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. Again, he sets a certain day today, saying through David much later in the words already quoted, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not speak later about another day. So then a Sabbath rest still remains for God's people, or for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest also cease from their labors as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one may fall through such disobedience as theirs. So first, something we're seeing here, and something that's very common for the Hebrews writer, is this strong connection to Israel's story. The Hebrews writer very much connects the church's story with Israel, uses Old Testament passages to explain their connection to who came before them. And so even though we see here that the Israelites in the desert, in the wilderness, were unfaithful, later we're going to see Israelites who were faithful, right? We see this juxtaposition, and we see this parallel in chapter 11 with the heroes of faith. So what is happening here? Well, this is another feature of Hebrews, is he has what we call exhortations or warnings. And so he wants them to remember, their own faith, their own allegiance to the God of Israel. And what we saw at the end of the Exodus and coming into the land, and we get to Joshua, and not all of the Israelites who left Egypt are allowed in. Moses doesn't even make it into the promised land. And so he's drawing on that story that some did not enter that rest. And so what we're seeing the Hebrews writer do is to say that there's still this hope of that rest still being available, and uses the image of the land of Israel, the promised land, as that the way of communicating that. Because what we're seeing in Hebrews is a group that's struggling with their place in the culture they live, and alienation to some degree, and maybe some form of persecution, And this was not uncommon in New Testament texts. We see it also in First Peter. We see it mentioned in other places. Revelation is one where we see this. And so he's encouraging them to remember the hope that is in front of them, and the hope that they have in Christ. And so when we talk about it, he uses Sabbath and he uses rest as the image of what they would be entering into, and he ties it back to Genesis 2. You know, in creation, and on the seventh day God rested. And this is a really interesting idea, because he's taking it and making a part of the historical progression of God's people, which is a really interesting idea. And it shows that Sabbath is not just, again, this thing that Jews did or do, or a part of Christianity in a way that would be required, but it's a basic mechanism of creation. It's a regular part of what God intended for creation. And we seek that rest. We seek that time in the garden on the seventh day that we see God participating in Genesis 2. And so we'll talk more about Genesis 2 next week. But this is what we've been working towards, is that Sabbath represents the part of the basic structure and architecture of creation. Rest is an important part of any and all creative aspects of our world. And so without rest, things don't have a chance to heal or rebuild themselves, or to gather themselves up. And so one of the things that I think about is our physical bodies are, when you exert it to a point where our muscles hurt, that is what we would call work or exertion. And if you don't give it a chance to rest and heal, then you do further damage. And so this is why athletes are supposed to have days of rest. And if you exercising 7 days a week is actually unhealthy in many ways. Doing a little bit of physical activity is one thing, but full-on exercise is not recommended 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so we see here, what we're seeing here is that rest is built into the very genetic code of creation, and we're seeking the fullness of that rest, the fullness of Sabbath, in the way that the Hebrews writer is encouraging and warning, right, these folks, that this is open, this hope lies before us, and Jesus is through whom we participate in that rest. And so the Hebrews text here really shows that Sabbath was not just it's not just a practice. It's not just a strange part of Israelite culture or Jewish culture. It is a very integral, interwoven aspect of creation and the life that we live with the Creator. And so that is what we're going to talk more about next week. We'll talk more about as God intended creation, that Sabbath and rest are a time of purposeful rest. So we'll talk about that next week, and we'll see you then.